And like, DeFi, if you're here for the oval conversation, you could argue like DeFi has a pretty bad image problem, right? Taxes, rug pools, there's criminality. I guess the question for this next panel is like, is there a way to de-risk DeFi? Are we moving toward a safer DeFi environment? How is DeFi evolving in a way that minimizes some of that downside risk, while also granting the access to free open markets that I think a lot of us here are interested in building, right? So this is going to be a great panel. We got a nice all-star cast, so we'll shout them out real quick. They're going to be in conversation with CoinDesk reporter Christian Sandor. It's going to be Tarun from Gauntlet. It's going to be Shahar from Fireblocks, Elena from Eunice, and Tyler from the Acronym Foundation, digging into the topic of de-risking DeFi. Let's give them a big old welcome to the stage. Thank you guys so much for being here. Let's kick this thing off. Let's do it.
For making until Friday, so we are getting close to the end. Thanks for being on stage. So DeFi risks. I wanted to start off the conversation with a fresh data point. Unify just reported that there's been more than $400 million of assets lost due to rug pulls, hacks, exploits, just in this year, and the past 2 years there's been more than $2 billion, $4 billion of assets lost. So you are handling, you and your companies, like different aspects of risk in decentralized finance. And I'm curious that what do you see as the most challenging or most like existential risk within DeFi that you're concerned with? Pick it up.
All right. I think there are many. It's a complex area, DeFi. Many things move really quickly. I think the number one thing that we see that's a big issue is maybe it's a combination of a good thing and a bad thing. A good thing is everything is open, everyone sees everything, right? So when someone builds something that's cool and useful and actually efficient and helps people, so it gets adopted really quickly. So we see this kind of hyper growth a lot with many projects. But combine this with a bad thing, which is people do not necessarily invest in security early on. So they say, okay, I'm going to do this later on. Once I get more adoption, once I get more funding, once it's really important. But then combine these two together and they get caught not ready, right? And the code is open source. You can see all the vulnerabilities, you can attack. There's many entry points. And so if you don't follow up, you don't learn from other people's mistakes, you don't invest in security early enough, you get hacked, you lose a lot, you lose your dream.
Yeah, it's a great one, and Tyler, that's probably best fitting for you that you are a builder, you are developing, so from your perspective, what's your consensus, what's your approach when you think through risks?
That's a hard question. But yeah, as a higher level, I think the real problem, at least from my perspective, is more abstract. So it'll be a little harder to find, but it's more like cultural than anything. And that, the people in this room, the builders, founders, VCs, right? We have this sort of mentality that it's okay to build these sorts of products or smart contracts and wait and see, or ship them very quickly, like sort of this like Silicon Valley software mentality of like, MVP, get it out the door, and then if it breaks, we'll fix it, right? And we'll scale it from there, which is a great mentality for more traditional and fast cycled software development. When you're building DeFi or financial products, that can get, and we know that there's a lot of degenerates out there that are going to start using this at massive scale with potential vulnerabilities, whatever those might be. I think that's like very irresponsible for the people just in the ecosystem, and that's something that I've taken, I take offense a lot to. It's like, all right, you're going to build a money market protocol. Like, it's pretty easy to put just guardrails on there within the contract that can be removed by governments and say, look, we're only going to let you deposit or borrow or whatever actions you can take. Let's say $10,000 or whatever the number is, but not tens of millions or hundreds of millions. right? Like actually ratchet it up as your protocol has been proven, as it becomes more safe, as you're not losing money, and as people want to then use it. And I don't think a lot of people have that mentality. And that is, I think, harming all of us of how we go about building something like, myself, whether it's audits, whether it's just the mentality of making sure that it's done right, the responsibility for users' money, like that stuff really matters. I think we're lacking that.
Yeah, so Al, you more like on the compliance side of DeFi, and Tyler just mentioned the limitations. So there's this kind of tension that DeFi is borderless, open source, anyone can do that, but also there needs to be some limitation on that. So I'm just curious on your point of view, that how do you see these two things, which kind of in the basis of DeFi being open, but also there needs to be a way to mitigate risks. How do you see that? See these two aspects get together?
So it's a good question, and building on Tyler's point, that is the tension in DeFi. The beauty of DeFi is the decentralization, the borderless nature, the opportunities that gives you. But also from a regulatory and compliance point of view, that can create a nightmare. For two reasons. First, as Tyler said, you can kind of build anything you want, right? At the moment, there are no limitations really on what you can build out there. So you could, if you don't build it to be compliant or to be kind of compliant with regulation or with any kind of compliance angle, it can kind of build on itself. And I think the second is that, we're kind of at an inflection point in crypto. We're going from a very lightly regulated industry to a regulated industry, and DeFi is a problematic area to regulate in the traditional financial services sense because it is by its very nature decentralized. So that tension is there, and I think building on Tyler's point, one way of addressing that is for the industry to be more involved in, setting up standards and standardizing things and having rules so that the regulators don't have to get as involved in setting them.
Yeah, Tarun, that's probably more directed to you because you are on the risk management side in Gauntlet, but also you're more like deeply involved on the tech side of DeFi. I wonder that, is there a way for DeFi to self-regulate? What degree of regulation DeFi needs? What's your perspective? Is this something like the technology can solve and mitigate risks or avoid those risks just purely on the technological level, or there needs to be some outside guardian for the ecosystem?
Yeah, so I don't know if there's much I can say that hasn't been said for the TradFi regulation side. Also, I'm not super deep enough, so I'll let other people talk more about that. But on the technical side, I think one kind of interesting evolutionary process you observe in DeFi is you have a protocol that has some type of mechanism. 5 people copy pasta of the same protocol, deploy it somewhere else. They didn't understand why certain decisions were made. The forks get hacked, and then usually there'll be someone who's like, I'm going to make another mechanism that avoids the particular hack that we saw before. So in lending markets, you saw this evolution from fully pooled mechanisms, which were fully cross-collateral, fully cross-margin, to some notion of isolation of pools of only certain assets to be used as collateral for certain types of borrowed assets, to now you have a bunch of different options for how isolation works. And I think there's actually this natural evolution you see where the market learns from the hacks and does create new mechanisms. Now, is that going to alone fix everything? No. But I actually think the techno-optimist version of this is that developers and researchers are learning from every hack and actually creating new protocols around avoiding those types of mistakes. I think it's just that there's kind of this race between people trying to grow their protocol versus how fast that natural process of learning these designs works. But I will say, compared to when I worked in traditional finance, this is a much faster evolution for these products because you can see where the mistake happened and it's all very transparent and public. And you have these very public postmortems of when there's a hack, what was it a code issue, was it an Oracle issue, was it a client issue, and having that level of detail actually allows you to build better products. So I think if we zoom out and instead of focusing myopically on like, okay, are we losing X dollars today versus are we learning lessons per dollar loss? Like, are we actually getting like significantly better mechanisms per, you can view the hacks as sort of an input cost to kind of making it more secure and long.
So you're saying there's evolution, so there's development in that sense that DeFi is getting more safer.
Over time, especially if you look at the protocols that have either the largest track record or the largest amount of TVL, those protocols are always constructing updates. They are always learning from other protocols and adopting features from each other. And I think if you look at that evolutionary process, that's very different than what you see in normal finance.
Yeah. One thing that I want to react on, or just want to tie my next question to, is that the copy pasting code that actually looking at what it does. So I'm curious. So since DeFi summer, there's been like 4 years DeFi, and there's been like a ton of new protocols popping up, and the whole DeFi ecosystem has become more complex, building on top of each other. Is that like an increased risk for any type of contagion event, that there's like one single point of failure, but that it spreads out to the broader ecosystem?
The short answer is yes. I think we saw that, right, and it kind of what makes some of the vulnerability disclosure processes in DeFi highly complex, right? Because everything is kind of tangled together. On top of the fact that obviously you have interoperability, but just in terms of code and dependencies, one project can impact many things. We see this in enterprise security as well, right? Like when there's either a supply chain attack or a vulnerability in a core library with many product views, it's a complex issue. When you look at DeFi, I think it's one step ahead in the difficulty because, again, everything is open, and if you know there's a vulnerability in a certain smart contract or a certain version of a certain function, it's very easy as an attacker to just look across the entire blockchain, find all the projects that are affected, and immediately see the return on investment if you decide to weaponize that exploit and act with that. I want to continue what Tarun was talking about with learning and connect that. Something we actually launched here at Consensus 2 days ago is the Crypto ISAC. It's Information Sharing and Analysis Center. It's a non-profit organization that's its goal is to facilitate information sharing for security and threat to its members, right? So if I'm seeing something, I can go on and I'm seeing like a breach or a new threat to our customers, I can share that with the vetted members, right? So Tarun can see this, and Tyler sees this, and Ella can see that, and they can take this internally, right? And it's a consortium of key players that will look to expand more and more, and I think this will ideally accelerate that learning process.
See that, so it's kind of, it seems like it's got, so I want to bring in the question of standardization that you mentioned earlier, that these kind of like initiatives from the industry, in what sense they can help these processes before regulation comes in to DeFi. Yeah, that's what you mean.
So I'm a real believer in some kind of industry approach on a lot of issues on DeFi, because I just think looking across the board, there's several areas where standardization would really help. One is the initiative that you were talking about, Shahar. I think that's great. I and that's an area where you really needed an industry approach. Another area which I'm quite passionate about with my background as a lawyer is the question of market manipulation and market abuse and how you deal with that, not just in crypto but in DeFi. Again, that's very difficult to do in theory if you apply a traditional finance lens to dealing with this issue because of the decentralized global nature of DeFi, you know, lots of different decentralized trading venues, money moving around the place. And one way that you can at least begin to deal with it is to have some kind of industry approach to market surveillance, to information sharing, which actually, I come from London and the UK is being talked about quite seriously. The other area of standardization that I think is important from a kind of quasi-regulatory and investor protection point of view is standardization relating to disclosure. You know, taxonomy of financial products and services. What should our disclosure requirements look like? What are you telling customers or people using a protocol or a DeFi product? So I think these are two areas where I think standardization would bring real benefits, both to the industry and also to the kind of wider ecosystem, and would help to address some of regulators' concerns.
So, yeah, this is kind of connected to regulation, but so something that Tyler, you mentioned yesterday when we were chatting in the speakers lounge is that what can actually help DeFi to make it less risky is to held someone accountable to the projects come forward and make the FSs go ahead. So I'm curious, when I think about, you know, as a user, that what kind of protocols should I use? So I'm curious that you are more on the developer side. So from a developer's perspective, how you think through these risk mitigation processes when you are building and coming out with the protocol?
I think that's kind of almost a little bit of a combination of all, like the past few minutes that we've been talking around what I would look at like is that protocol contagion or the protocol risk of reusing pieces of code, especially when they're forced, like Tarun talked about perfectly, which is sort of if you're not just blindly forking something and you actually are intelligently building it and you're reusing portions of code and you're now having a whole separate eyes on it and a whole separate team on it, that becomes so much more robust. And that is not at all like traditional software. Like that doesn't happen at all. It's all closed source. No one ever sees it. There could be a bug in eBay, PayPal software for years and years and years and no one will ever know about it. But so now it's going to get discovered really quickly when you have a whole fresh set of a team and then another one and another one. So you start getting where those like modules or contracts or components become like relatively pretty robust and safe. So as a user, I would be looking towards seeing people building with those standardized products. So for me, I would, be really, I don't want to say concerned, but let's say someone builds a new DeFi protocol and they completely reinvent a governance contract. I say, okay, well, sure, you can do whatever you'd like to do. But there's a really great one that has been made and remade and evolved and is right there for everyone to use that 99% of DeFi protocols use. So if you're not using that and you've done something different, like what's so novel about what you've done that you just wouldn't use that? So that would be like a really big red flag for me. So I think the more that we can be attuned to that, of when you're modifying or using different pieces that are very easily available, like there could be some concern around how it's getting built or why a team would do that. And it might even be, even if it's not nefarious, it could just even be assessing the team's ability and skill itself when there is something that they don't need to focus on, yet they rebuild it from scratch themselves, make it more complex, make it harder to understand. Like, why would you be doing that? Like, if you're a great team, you think, focus on the things that make your protocol unique and not reinvent all these pieces that you don't have to. Which then goes back to kind of my first point around responsibility, and you wouldn't do that, right? You want to be responsible for your users and use things that are battle tested and not gonna lose funds.
Yeah, Tarun, this is a question directed more to you because you're also an investor. You have Gauntlet Ventures. You're a part of that. So I'm curious that how does your due diligence look like when you are looking at investing in a new startup? connecting to DeFi, for example, at an early stage. So what's your thought process there? What are the risks and red flags you are looking for? Or looking for.
Yeah.
To avoid that investment.
I think like the baseline things to look at are, how much rigor do they actually put in their docs? So, reading their contracts very carefully and then looking at their documentation and seeing if the intent, the high level intent of what they wanted to express that is in the doc, whether it's a white paper or whether it's actually the code docs, actually matches what the code semantics are doing. We spend a lot of time also just like running people's code, testing it, making sure the basic stuff works, like do your unit test run. If your unit tests don't run, like why would I put money? And then of course it's like, hey, if it's a more complicated thing, it hasn't even been built yet, then it's about spending a lot of time looking at the history of the team's development processes, as well as the team's sort of technical and research kind of chops over time. One thing I will say to Tyler's point is that, if I look at DeFi over these last 4 or 5 years, and you look at where capital has concentrated in terms of like which protocols, you do see this kind of like Pareto-ish distribution of like, okay, well, yeah, most of the capital ended up staying in the protocols that have the longest track record or the best emergency response. Like when there was an emergency, whether it was a large hack or a small hack, there was like fast response. And so I think, on a long enough time horizon, the market does eventually learn allocation rules. It just might make some blunders along the way, like Luna. But I think there is a sense in which, in aggregate, there is some collective wisdom. It's just like it's much slower than say the attack time. And I do think though the market does appreciate things like how well emergency responses happen, how well communication happens, and also again, clarity in writing is actually extremely important. I think something as an investor I find hard to kind of grapple sometimes is people have very good clarity of telling you what they are doing in words, verbally, but then cannot write down what they're saying to do, because then their intent, high-level intent, and their actual execution oftentimes disagree quite a bit. So a lot of that is sort of a little bit also like a software interview or quant interview where you're trying to reason through how people's decision processes map to like their execution process.
This is just
I think I really agree, and I think it's true also when you look at the off-chain part of this, right? Because any new project, any project is comprised of many smart contracts, and you need to orchestrate some kind of management protocol, right? The result is off-chain, or the people who can initiate sensitive operations, right? The intent of what we want to achieve as both business and operation. And the layer of the operational security is also something we see that varies very significantly between different teams depending on their maturity, understanding of security, right? Because if you build your software perfectly fine, okay, there's also software, right? Like no bugs, no vulnerabilities, everything is perfect. But off-chain, the key that is the owner of the entire thing is just being stored on someone's laptop. So it's still, you're gonna be breached, but not on-chain with like a smart contract vulnerability. You're gonna be breached when someone, sends a phishing email to one of your engineers and they open a fake job offering and suddenly North Korea has access to the machine and they steal your money, right? So the governance mechanism that you have off-chain that manages and controls which of your users, assuming you are an organization, not just two-person team, the governance mechanism, the risk hedging that's happening off-chain with separation of duties and who can do what is extremely important, and it's a very big part of the picture. And you can see many hacks that involve this as well, both for centralized exchanges, but also stuff that's happened 100% on-chain.
Yeah. So, building on that, Tyler, I'm curious that if you would recommend something for a new protocol before launching, what are the basic things that they need to keep in mind just to avoid all these failures?
with as much discretion as possible, take your time and see what's out there. When auditing is available and you have the funds to be able to contribute to that, I think if you have high ambitions or you've raised money for your project, you really should fund audits as best as you possibly can and go through whatever it's going to take there. Audits are not perfect by any means, but it's going to get you more people looking through your code, getting you thinking about it. They'll question why you made those decisions. Perfect. I mean, what Tarun had said is like, what was your execution intent, right? And going through an audit, a good firm will ask you all of this because they're going to read through it and say, why did you do this? Why did you do this? Why did you do this? And if you have good answers to that, you want to go through that entire process, right? So maybe you didn't think through it the way that you should have. So I think the audit process and being very, very engaged in it and not just thinking of it as, oh, we're going to pay money for someone to just give me a check mark and then we're going to go proceed. I think that's really the wrong way to look at it. Having a very engaged audit process, moving slowly, going through that process, just accountability, and I think that's probably the most important.
Okay. Al, we are coming to the kind of like the last round of questions and comments that you kind of mentioned that regulation is coming whether we want it or not. So the new protocol, how can a new protocol navigate that? DeFi is borderless by nature, but how can a new protocol navigate all the different jurisdictions and all these rules that it's not affirmed that we don't know that what's going to happen in the next couple of years, but what could you recommend for a project who's about to launch to prepare for what's coming?
It's a very good question, and there isn't actually an easy answer because the regulatory environment at the moment for DeFi is really uncertain. Leaving aside the US, I can probably comment on the kind of European and UK position. We don't have DeFi regulation. For example, the European Commission is writing a report at the moment. They're going to be giving it to the European Parliament by the end of the year, so we don't really know what it's going to look like. And that makes it very difficult to actually plan for anything. Tyler and I were having a conversation about this exact point backstage, and what he said, which I thought was a really great point, is that in this kind of environment, you build something which is flexible. So I think one thing that you think of as a kind of new protocol is, what is the regulation likely to look like? What are people talking about? What are the consultation papers saying? Where do we think this might go? And then build your product with enough flexibility that you can potentially pivot or change if regulation comes in that doesn't fit with your business model. That's the best you can do at the moment.
Yeah. Wrap-up question, Tarun, quickly to you. That what do you expect from DeFi to make steps towards making it more safer in the midterm?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of focus on like automation for interactions. As protocols get more complicated, that means that users have to send more transactions, have more interactions, more live interventions in their expression of what sort of assets they want to invest in. And I think in the long term, there's going to be this cat and mouse game between how complicated the protocols are and how much yield you can get out of those versus how complicated the user interactions are. And the two of them are going to get matched, by these kind of increasingly, two types of systems. One is there's much smarter automation within the wallet or MPC setup. And the other is that, things are going to be sort of there's going to be kind of intent-like systems or RFQ-like systems that get more complicated that allow strategic actors to execute on your behalf, but with tons of covenants and constraints.
Awesome. Thanks for your time. Awesome chat. Give a round of applause, please.